The galaxy dismissed the warning about humans. Then came the reckoning. The chamber was already laughing before Ambassador Yale Duran finished her first sentence. I heard it from the back row, where junior diplomats were placed, far from the central podium, far from the lights, far from anything that mattered. A low sound like wind moving through a pipe, rising and falling in waves across 43 alien delegations seated in concentric arcs around the speaking floor. It was not the laughter of cruelty, not exactly. It was something worse. It was the laughter of beings who did not believe they needed to pay attention. I was 26 years old. I had worked 4 years to earn a seat on that diplomatic shuttle. I had studied 11 alien languages, passed 17 security clearances, and memorized the full procedural charter of the Galactic Conclave in 3 of its official translations. And I sat in the back row and watched the most important woman I had ever known stand alone at the center of the known galaxy and be laughed at. Yale Duran did not flinch. She was 61 years old, short, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that people mistake for patience. I had known her for 4 years. I knew it was not patience. It was calculation. She stood at the podium with her hands clasped in front of her and waited for the laughter to finish the way a person waits for rain to pass. Not hoping it would stop. Simply certain that it would, eventually, because everything does. The chamber was called the Hall of Recognition, which I later understood was a translation that did not fully carry over. In the Keth language, the original builders of the station, the word meant something closer to the hall where things are decided about you. The distinction felt important to me, standing there. We were not in a hall of recognition. We were in a hall where things were being decided about us. The Keth delegate, a tall being with iridescent skin that shifted color with every shift in mood, was the loudest in his amusement. His name, in a form humans could pronounce, was Counselor Veth. He sat in the first ring, 3 body lengths from the podium, and he did not bother to hide his expression. His skin ran gold, which I had learned was the Keth color for mild contempt. Yale began again when the sound faded. She presented Earth's application for full membership in the Galactic Conclave, defense tier classification, and equal access to the protected shipping lanes that connected the inner systems. Her voice was steady and clear, and carried no apology in it. She presented our history because the charter required it. Every applicant species must demonstrate developmental coherence, which meant showing where you had come from and how you had survived getting here. That was where the laughter came back. Our history, by any honest accounting, was difficult to frame. We had fought each other across continents for 10,000 years. We had developed weapons capable of ending all life on our planet and had, on more than one occasion, come within hours of using them. We had poisoned our own atmosphere, stripped our forests, collapsed ecosystems, and then turned around and rebuilt them with the same ferocious energy that had destroyed them. We had survived 17 events that, by conclave classification standards, should have ended us. 17. Counselor Veth's translator carried his words to every seat in the chamber. They nearly eliminated themselves 17 times. They are not a threat. They are simply reckless. A species that cannot manage its own homeworld cannot manage itself among the stars. His skin shifted to a pale, dismissive silver. The application is generous in spirit. But the conclave does not extend defense tier recognition to juvenile civilizations that have not demonstrated the emotional maturity required for partnership. There was murmuring across the rings, not disagreement, agreement. I looked at Yale. She had not moved. Her hands were still clasped. Her face was still calm. A delegate from the Vreth Collective, a smaller being with layered speaking membranes that gave her voice a soft harmonic quality, rose to second the Keth assessment. Her name was S. Salin. I noticed her because she was the only delegate who did not seem amused. She did not look contemptuous either. She looked curious. She was studying Yale the way a scientist studies something that does not behave according to expectations. The vote was not close. 38-5 with 5 abstentions. Earth was granted Category 2 juvenile species status, which came with trade observation rights, no defense recognition, no weapons treaty access, and no shipping lane protections without Keth supervision. The word supervision sat in my chest like a stone. Yale thanked the chamber for its time. She gathered her documents. She turned and walked back toward our section of the gallery, and as she passed through the outer ring, Counselor Veth spoke one more time, loud enough for her to hear, perhaps intended to be heard, perhaps not. "They will spend 20 years arguing among themselves about the result," he said to his attaché, in a tone that assumed Yale could not understand Keth, "and then they will apply again with a prettier presentation." Yale did not stop walking, but as she passed me, I saw her face for just 1 second clearly before she arranged it back into its professional stillness. She was not angry. She was not hurt. She looked like someone who had just confirmed something she had long suspected. She stopped beside me and spoke quietly so that only I could hear. "Write down everything you observed today, every delegate's reaction, every color shift from the Keth, every species that abstained, and write down the exact phrasing Veth used, exact words, not summaries." I pulled out my recorder. Should I flag it for the Foreign Affairs report? "No," she said, "flag it for defense research." That was the moment I understood that something had shifted, not in the chamber, in us. I spent the shuttle ride home watching Yale work through a set of documents she had not shared with anyone else on the delegation. I could not see the content clearly, only that they were dense with figures and timelines, and that one page, which she held slightly longer than the others, had a header I managed to read from the angle of my seat. It said, "Projected development window, 44 years." I did not ask what it meant. I was 26 and sharp enough to understand that some questions are best answered by watching rather than asking. Yale Duran was already planning something. She had been planning it before we left Earth. The vote had not surprised her. The laughter had not hurt her. She had needed to hear exactly what the conclave would say, in their own words, on the official record, in the hall where things are decided about you. Now she had it. And I remember thinking, as the stars stretched past the viewport and the station shrank behind us, that the conclave had made a precise and catastrophic error. Not the kind that announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind that only becomes visible years later, when you look back and try to identify the exact moment everything changed, and you find it was a moment that looked, at the time, like nothing at all. It looked like a woman walking out of a chamber with her documents tucked under her arm. It looked like losing. The first thing they told us when we returned to Earth was that the conclave's decision was being processed through diplomatic review. That was the official language. In the hallways of the Foreign Affairs building in London, where Yale Duran held her first closed-door briefing after the vote, the language was different. I stood outside that room for 4 hours. When the people inside came out, they looked like people who had been told not the news they feared, but the confirmation of something they had quietly, carefully, already prepared for. Nobody cried. Nobody raised their voice. They got to work. I was reassigned 3 days after we landed. My new position had a title that sounded administrative: Senior Documentation Analyst, Office of Developmental Infrastructure. The office had 6 people in it. None of them were administrators. One was a physicist who had published more papers on propulsion theory than anyone alive. One was a former special operations planner who now consulted on what she called adaptive response architecture. One was a woman named Claire, who had spent 8 years studying Keth psychology, and whose official title was cultural liaison, but who spent her days building behavioral models of how the Keth High Council made decisions under pressure. I was, as it turned out, the youngest person by 11 years. On my first morning, Yale called the 6 of us into a small conference room with no windows, offered coffee, and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It contained 3 sentences. The conclave will not protect us. The conclave has confirmed they do not consider us a threat. We have 44 years before our current population distribution and technology trajectory makes conflict statistically unavoidable. She looked around the table. We are not going to spend those 44 years asking for a seat. We are going to spend them building one. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the physicist, a man named Grant, tapped the paper twice with one finger. 44 is the low estimate, he said. I would say 40. Then we move faster, Yale said. That was the beginning of what I later understood was the most significant undertaking in human history. At the time, it did not look that way. It looked like a small group of people in a room without windows, drinking bad coffee and doing paperwork. The paperwork, as it happened, was the cover for everything. The conclave's Category 2 classification came with one benefit that Veth and his colleagues had not considered carefully enough: observation rights. Earth was permitted to send a small number of official observers to any non-restricted conclave event, installation, or territory. It was meant to be a courtesy. It was meant to give junior species the experience of watching how civilization worked so that, in 50 or 100 years, when they were mature enough for real membership, they would already understand the procedures. What it actually did was give humanity access. Grant handled the physics division. Within the first 2 years, working from what our observers had gathered and what we had quietly reverse-engineered from licensed trade equipment, his team identified 3 theoretical barriers in propulsion, engineering that the conclave species had declared impossible to cross. They declared them impossible because their own physics models told them so. Grant's team, approaching the problem without any of that foundational literature, without the academic tradition that had told every conclave physicist that these things could not be done, simply tried anyway. Without knowing they were not supposed to succeed, they succeeded twice in the first 3 years. The third barrier took another 5 years and produced a drive system that, when tested quietly in the outer asteroid belt, pushed an unmanned probe to a velocity that no licensed conclave vessel could match at standard configuration. Grant left the result in the report with no emphasis on it, just a number in a table. I asked him once why he hadn't highlighted it more clearly. He said, if we highlight it, someone might ask us to share it. That was the kind of thinking that ran through everything we did in those years. Quiet, deliberate, generous on the surface, careful underneath. Claire's work was harder to measure but more important in the long run. She built a library of behavioral profiles for every species on the conclave with defense tier status. Not profiles of their technology, profiles of their psychology, what frightened them, what embarrassed them, what they valued so deeply that threatening it would produce irrational decisions, what made them hesitate, what made them overcommit. The Keth, she determined, operated on a status model that was almost mathematically predictable. They responded to public challenge with immediate and disproportionate force, but only when witnesses were present. Alone or in small groups, they were cautious and conservative. They perform aggression, she wrote in one of her reports. They don't prefer it. The performance is for the audience. Remove the audience and they're actually quite reasonable. She also noted, in the same report, that the Keth had never in their recorded history fought an opponent who did not flinch. I read that line 3 times. Meanwhile, the terraforming program was announced publicly, with full conclave notification. We were permitted to expand within 7 star systems under our Category 2 designation, and we announced an ambitious civilian colonization effort across 4 of them. The conclave observed this with no particular concern. Colonization was normal. It was what junior species did with their energy when they weren't yet capable of anything more sophisticated. What the conclave did not observe was what the colony ships carried in addition to settlers. Every colony ship had 2 full manifests. One was submitted to the conclave observation office. The other was filed in an archive that existed in no connected network. The second manifest listed the additional structural components that every colony installation included in its foundation layer. Not weapons, not military hardware, nothing that a passing inspection would flag. Instead, every colony was built on a platform architecture that could, with a software deployment that took 48 seconds, become something else entirely. I was the person who designed the filing system for those second manifests. I spent 3 years on it. The filing system was, in my professional opinion, the most boring and most important thing I have ever built. We also began a program that had no name in official documentation. I called it the Mirror Project in my personal notes. It was simple in concept. Take everything the Conclave had publicly dismissed about humans, our emotional intensity, our stubborn refusal to accept defeat, our tendency to treat problems as personal challenges rather than strategic calculations, and find out what those traits actually produced in extended conflict scenarios. The results were not what any of us expected, and we had expected quite a lot. Human units in simulated extended operations did not degrade the way Conclave tactical models predicted they would. They adapted. The longer the simulation ran, the more creative the responses became. The more resource-constrained the scenario, the more efficiently the units operated. And in scenarios where the human side was objectively losing by every standard metric, something strange and consistent happened. They found angles that the scenario designers had not included, because the designers had assumed any rational actor would have accepted defeat several moves earlier. The report on those simulations ran to 400 pages. The executive summary was a single paragraph. The last sentence of that paragraph read, "The primary strategic asset of human forces under sustained pressure is not technology or numbers or positional advantage. It is the apparent inability to recognize a situation as unwinnable." Yale read that sentence and asked Claire to cross-reference it with the Keth behavioral profile. Claire came back 2 days later. She looked like she had not slept. She sat down in the conference room and said, "The Keth have no contingency model for an opponent who doesn't stop." Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Yale looked at me and said, "Update the development window. We may be ahead of schedule." We were in year 9 of 40. We had not built a single weapon. We had not threatened anyone. We had not violated a single term of our Category 2 classification. And we had already quietly changed the shape of everything. The colony installations multiplied. Grant's drive systems went into the 3rd and 4th generation. Claire's behavioral library expanded to include 7 additional Conclave species. The second manifests grew thicker every year, and the software that managed them was updated and tested and updated again, until the 48-second deployment window was down to 11 seconds. Our observers at the Conclave continued to attend sessions. They were polite and attentive and asked thoughtful questions that made the senior delegates feel respected. They filed their public reports promptly. They never caused trouble. One of them, a young man named Oliver, was stationed at the Conclave Research Exchange when a Keth intelligence team ran a routine scan of human communications logs that passed through the station's shared relay. They found some of our internal planning files, not the sensitive ones. The real documents lived on isolated systems that never touched the relay. What the Keth found was a layer of administrative redundancy that looked confusing and bureaucratically cluttered. They filed a report describing it as evidence of poor organizational management. They were not wrong about the redundancy. They were simply wrong about what it was redundant for. S. Salen, the Vreth delegate who had studied Yale from across the chamber on the day of the vote, had quietly followed human activity for years. She was not assigned to do so. It was personal curiosity. She filed a minority report through the Vreth Collective's own channels, not the Conclave's main system, in the 11th year after the vote. It was not long. It said, "These creatures do not plan for war. They plan for having already lost one. I do not know what to do with this observation, but I believe it is important." Her supervisor returned the report with a single annotation: outside scope of current mandate. The report was filed, the archive accepted it, nobody read it. And we kept building. By year 30, we had 17 fully established colony installations across 6 star systems. By year 35, Oliver's generation had taken senior positions in our diplomatic corps, our research divisions, and our infrastructure command. They had grown up with the second manifests. They had grown up knowing what the 11-second deployment meant. They were calm about it in a way that their parents' generation had needed years to achieve. By year 38, Grant was 72 years old and had stopped attending daily briefings. He came in 3 days a week and spent the other 4 writing what he called his personal notes, which were actually a 6th-generation manual for the drive systems, and which he updated obsessively with every new piece of test data. I was 64. I ran the documentation division and still checked the second manifests personally every month. Old habit. Yale Duran had retired from public service at 74, but still came into the office on Tuesday mornings and sat in the chair by the window that had been informally designated as hers since the beginning. She didn't always say much on those mornings. Sometimes she just read. Sometimes she watched the feed from the colony installations. In year 40, Councillor Veth of the Keth Dominion announced that 3 human colony worlds fell within a newly defined Keth territorial boundary, and that, under the terms of Earth's Category 2 classification, the installations would be subject to Keth administrative oversight with immediate effect. The official conclave notification arrived on a Tuesday morning. Yale was in the office, in her chair, reading a book. She set the book down when I read the notification aloud. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Which 3?" I told her. She nodded slowly. Cassian Roman 4 is one of them. Yes. She picked her book back up. Then it begins, she said, and turned the page. And for the first time in 40 years, I felt something that was not patience or calculation or quiet preparation. I felt something faster than any of that. I felt it in my hands and in my chest and behind my eyes. We were ready. The Keth fleet that arrived at Cassian Roman 4 was not a small one. That told us something important even before the first transmission was sent. A small fleet would have meant routine administrative enforcement, the kind of action that confident powers take when they are moving pieces on a board they believe they control. A small fleet would have meant they didn't think we would respond in any meaningful way, which was consistent with everything they had said about us for 40 years. But they sent a large fleet. That told us they had doubts they hadn't expressed publicly. I was at the Cassian Roman 4 Operations Center remotely, connected through a relay that Grant's teams had built into the installation's infrastructure in year 12, and which did not appear on any schematic filed with the Conclave Observer Office. The Operations Center was actually a small room adjacent to the colony's primary water processing unit, which had been selected because it was the last place any incoming inspection would think to look for anything important. The colony administrator at Cassian Roman 4 was a woman named Helen. She was 43, had been stationed there for 11 years, and had 2 children who attended the installation school 300 meters away. When the Keth fleet's approach was confirmed, she had already run the evacuation sequence twice in the past week. Practice. The second practice run had completed in 3 hours and 50 minutes. She had not been satisfied with that. She ran it again after dinner that evening, and got it down to 3 hours and 22 minutes. When the real sequence began, her people were off the installation in 3 hours and 9 minutes. 1,214 colonists, every one of them. The children's school was the second group to evacuate, not the first, because Helen had determined in her planning that making children first would create a rush dynamic that slowed the overall time. She was precise about these things. The Keth fleet entered Cashin Roman 4 orbit and hailed the installation. No response. They hailed again. Still nothing. The fleet commander, whose name translated roughly as high-voiced Tesseract, spent 40 minutes attempting contact before concluding that the colony had been abandoned in panic and sending an assessment team to the surface. The assessment team reported that the colony was empty, orderly, and showed no signs of distress or hasty departure. The food stores were sealed. The equipment was powered down correctly. The water systems were running on automatic maintenance cycles. It looked less like an evacuation and more like everyone had simply finished their work for the day and gone home, except there was no home for them to go to on the surface. Tesseract filed his initial report describing the situation as unexpected but manageable. The Keth intended to establish an administrative presence and begin processing the installation for oversight integration. Standard procedure. He had his team begin that process at dawn the next morning, local time. At dawn plus 4 minutes, the orbital platforms came online. I want to be precise about what the orbital platforms were, because the conclave spent a great deal of time afterward trying to categorize them, and found that none of their existing categories applied cleanly. They were not weapons platforms in the conventional sense. They did not carry anything that appeared on any restricted technology list. Each platform was, technically, a communications relay and environmental monitoring station, which is what the conclave documents said and which was true. They did relay communications. They did monitor the environment. They also, upon receiving the 11-second software deployment, became something that the conclave's legal language had no word for. The closest translation that anyone ever managed was automated consequence systems. They did not target ships. They targeted decisions. Specifically, they were designed to respond to any action within a defined zone that matched a library of predefined aggressive postures, and to respond to that action with precision, proportional, and immediate consequence. Tesseract's fleet was in the defined zone. His assessment teams on the surface had taken actions that matched 17 entries in the library simultaneously, because their standard administrative procedure had not been designed with the awareness that anyone had been watching and cataloging their administrative procedures for 30 years. The platforms responded. I am not going to describe the next 11 minutes in technical detail because that is not what mattered. What mattered was the silence that came after them, the kind of silence that has weight, the kind you feel in your ears. Tesseract's fleet was not destroyed. That was a deliberate choice, built into the platform logic by the woman who had designed the response architecture, who had spent 8 years modeling Keth psychology, and who understood that a destroyed fleet becomes a rallying point. A fleet that has been decisively stopped and is still present, with all its crew alive and all its commanders still at their stations, is not a rallying point. It is an education. Tesseract's initial transmission after the platforms went quiet was 17 minutes of silence. Then his voice came through, and I noticed what I had been told to listen for, the change in register. The Keth language has 12 tonal registers. Tesseract had opened every communication in the highest register, which conveys certainty and authority. His first transmission after the platforms went quiet was in the 7th register. The 7th register is the one Keth use when speaking to someone they have just understood they underestimated. Our diplomatic team arrived 6 hours later. I was not on that shuttle. I was too old for field work and Helen needed my relay connection to stay stable, but I watched the feed. The lead negotiator was a man named Aaron, who was 38 and had grown up knowing what the second manifests were, and was consequently not even slightly nervous sitting across from a Keth fleet commander. He had a document case with him. He set it on the table and opened it, and placed a single folder in front of Tesseract. Inside the folder was a ceasefire proposal. It was 4 pages. It was polite. It was comprehensive. It had been written 2 years earlier. Tesseract looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at Aaron. You prepared this, he said, in the 8th register now, which is one step above the 7th. It is the register Keth use when they have understood something that embarrasses them. You prepared this before we arrived. We prepared it before you announced the boundary, Aaron said. Tesseract looked at the document again. How long before? 2 years. The silence that followed was, by my count, 40 seconds. For a Keth, who processes social information at approximately twice the speed of a human, 40 seconds of silence is a very long time. We will consider the proposal, Tesseract said finally. Of course, Aaron said, there is no deadline on our end. Back in London, the Conclave's emergency channel lit up within the hour. The Keth filed a formal complaint describing what had happened at Cashin Roman 4 as an unprovoked act of hostility by a Category 2 species, a violation of Conclave Charter provisions, and a threat to galactic stability. The language was confident. The language was the kind of language that is used when you want to make something that happened to you sound like something you are in control of. The Conclave's response was to convene an emergency session. S. Salin's granddaughter, a young Vreth delegate named Tella who had just completed her first year on the Conclave floor, went to the archive the evening before the session. She pulled her grandmother's minority report from 40 years ago. She read it twice. Then she read the Cashin Roman 4 assessment report that the Keth had just filed. Then she read the report our observers had quietly submitted through their official channel, which was calm and factual, and included, as an appendix, a list of every conclave session at which Keth delegates had publicly described human beings as non-threatening. Tella brought all 3 documents to the session and said nothing for the first 2 hours. She was watching. In London, Yale Duran was still in her chair by the window when I connected to tell her what had happened at the session so far. She listened. Then she said, "What is the Conclave's primary concern right now?" "They are not sure what we have," I said. "They don't know how much of it there is. They keep asking for a full disclosure of our defense infrastructure." "And what did Aaron's team say?" "They said we would be happy to provide full disclosure through the proper diplomatic channels, and that we were preparing the documentation now." Yale smiled. It was a quiet smile. "How long will the documentation take to prepare?" Aaron told them it was a large file set, and they should allow several weeks for processing. "Good," she paused, "and when they receive it?" "It will show them everything. Every platform, every ship, every installation, every system, all of it accurate and complete. And their reaction to the numbers." I thought about how to phrase it. "We believe their reaction will be considerable." "Yes," she said. She looked out the window for a moment. The London sky was gray and low and ordinary. "It usually is," she said, "when the answer to a question turns out to be twice what anyone imagined, and it will not be everything, of course." "No," I said, "it will not be everything." She nodded. "Then we wait for the session to finish and we see what they decide and we go from there." She picked up her book again. "Call me when Tella speaks." I went back to my station. I watched the feed, and I thought about Tesseract in the 7th register. I thought about the 11-second deployment and Helen's evacuation time and Aaron's document case, and the fact that the ceasefire proposal had been written 2 years before the Keth announced the boundary. I thought about what it meant to spend 40 years preparing for a conversation, and how that preparation looked, from the outside, like weakness. It looked like patience. It looked like a Category 2 species making do with what it had. And I thought about how none of them, not Veth, not Tesseract, not the 38 delegates who had voted against us in that chamber 40 years ago, had ever once asked why a species that had survived 17 extinction-level events was still here. Not luck, not accident, not recklessness. They had never asked the question, so they had never gotten the answer. We were still here because we had never, not once in 10,000 years, been able to convince ourselves that something was finished when it was not finished yet. And it was not finished yet. When the Keth brought the full council of the Galactic Conclave into emergency session, they expected to be believed. They had been the most powerful voice in that chamber for 200 years. They had built the station. They had written most of the charter. They had defined, with considerable self-satisfaction, what the word civilized meant in galactic diplomatic language. They were believed. That was not the problem. The problem was that being believed was not the same as being safe. And by the time the emergency session opened, the distinction had become clear to anyone paying careful attention. Tella was paying careful attention. She sat in the third ring, which was where junior delegates from associate species were placed, and she did not speak for the first full day of proceedings. She listened to the Keth present their case, that human beings, a Category 2 juvenile species with no defense recognition, had deployed weapons systems at Cashin Roman 4 in direct violation of their classification status, that this represented a threat to Conclave stability, and that the Conclave was obligated to respond with unified enforcement action. The response from most of the chamber was predictable: concern, alarm, agreement that something needed to be done. The question of what needed to be done produced less agreement because nobody in that chamber actually knew what they were dealing with. That was the gap Tella stepped into. She raised her speaking membrane on the second morning and asked for the floor. She got it because she was young and junior, and therefore assumed to have something brief and polite to say before the real delegates continued. "I would like to read 3 documents into the record," she said. "I will not summarize them. I will read them in full because I believe the full language matters." The first was her grandmother's minority report from 40 years ago, every word of it. The chamber was quiet because the chamber did not know what to do with a document they had never read that was clearly relevant and clearly old. Councillor Veth's current successor, a delegate named Korath, shifted twice in his seat during the reading. The second document was the Cashin Roman 4 assessment report filed by Tesseract. The third was the human observer's submission to the conclave, including the appendix. She set the documents down and looked at the chamber. "I am not saying the Keth are incorrect that something significant happened at Cashin Roman 4, she said. "I am saying that 40 years ago, a Vreth analyst identified that something significant was coming, and we filed her report in an archive and did not read it. I am asking what else we have filed in archives and not read." That question sat in the air for a long time. The answer, as it turned out, was quite a lot. In London, the documentation package was nearly ready. I had spent 3 weeks checking it personally, the way I had always checked the second manifests, line by line, because the details mattered and I was old enough to know that details done carelessly have a way of producing results nobody wanted. The package was accurate. Every ship, every platform, every installation was listed. The numbers were correct. The numbers were also, by conclave estimation standards, impossible. Not impossible in a theoretical sense. Impossible in the sense that nobody in that chamber had believed a Category 2 species with 44 years, and no defense recognition could accumulate what that list described. Aaron transmitted the package on a Wednesday morning. He included a cover letter that was 3 sentences long and contained no threats, no ultimatums, and no emotional language whatsoever. It said, "Please find attached the full inventory of Earth's defensive infrastructure, as requested. All listed systems are operational. We remain available for discussion at your convenience." I was in the relay room when the conclave's reaction began coming through. Not official transmissions. The informal channels, the ones that observers listened to and that moved faster and more honestly than any official document. The first reaction was silence, which lasted approximately 2 hours. The second reaction was a rapid escalation of internal conclave communications that our relay systems were not supposed to be able to intercept. except that Grant had updated the relay systems in year 27. Korath called an immediate closed session of the Defense Committee. The Defense Committee had not met in closed session in 11 years because there had not been anything that required a closed session. They were in the room for 6 hours. Meanwhile, the Keth responded to the inventory by doing exactly what Claire had predicted they would do. They performed. They filed a second formal complaint accusing Earth of illegal military development, of deception, of violating the spirit if not the letter of the Category 2 classification, and of threatening galactic peace. The language was strong. The language was designed for an audience. The audience was not impressed in the way Korath had expected. Because Tella had put Salan's report into the record, and once it was in the record, other delegates had read it. And once they had read it, several of them had gone looking for other things in the archive that might be worth reading. They found, over the course of a week, 14 other minority reports and 3 observer assessments from various species over the past 4 decades, each of which had flagged something specific about human behavior that the main chamber had declined to act on. The pattern those documents formed, read together, was not the pattern of a reckless juvenile species stumbling around the stars. It was the pattern of a species that had been watching and learning and preparing with extraordinary discipline for a very long time. Korath called for a unified enforcement response. He used the word unified with great emphasis, because unity was the Keth's traditional mechanism for getting the conclave to do what the Keth wanted. When unity was invoked, species that might prefer to abstain felt social pressure to participate. 9 species abstained anyway. That had never happened before in response to a Keth call for unity, not once. One of the species that abstained sent a private transmission to Earth's diplomatic office the same afternoon. It was from a small trading civilization called the Alluri, who had held observer status for 30 years, and who had quietly been receiving human medical research through back channels for the last 15 of those years. The transmission was 2 sentences. It said, "We remember who helped us when our breeding population collapsed. We will not be part of this." I cried when I read that one. I was 67 years old and I was not ashamed of it. I cried because it meant we had been right about something more important than any of the tactical decisions. We had been right about what kind of species we wanted to be. The Keth did not call for a vote on unified enforcement. They had counted, and the count was not favorable. Instead, they shifted strategies and demanded a direct negotiation with Earth's senior diplomatic representation, which is what they called for when they wanted to establish dominance in a smaller room. They got Aaron again. Aaron arrived at the negotiation table on the conclave station with a team of 4. He was 39 by now. He had added a small scar above one eyebrow from a shuttle incident 3 months earlier that he was irrationally proud of. He sat down across from Korath and 4 senior Keth delegates and waited for them to begin. Korath opened by stating that the Keth Dominion recognized Earth's clear technical capabilities and was prepared to discuss a revised framework for the Keth-human relationship that acknowledged Earth's developmental progress. He did not use the phrase Category 2. That had taken some courage on his part. Aaron said that was very kind, and that Earth was also prepared to discuss a revised framework. He opened his document case. Inside was a folder that contained a copy of the original charter of the Galactic Conclave, annotated in Earth's legal notation system, with 17 specific clauses highlighted. "We have identified several areas in the existing charter where we believe clarification would be mutually beneficial," Aaron said, "specifically around the rights and protections of species in the process of status transitions, the definition of defensive infrastructure under current law, and the review mechanism for decisions made under Category 2 designations." He paused. "We have also prepared a draft amendment to the Charter's first recognition clause. It is short. We thought the language was clear, but we are open to refinement." Korath looked at the annotated charter. His skin shifted 3 times in quick succession in a pattern I did not know, but Claire told me later was the Keth equivalent of someone taking a very long breath. "You intend to renegotiate the charter," Korath said. "We intend to improve it," Aaron said. The Keth delegation asked for a recess. They got one. They used it to call Tesseract, who was still in orbit above Cashin Roman 4, because Tesseract had actually spoken with Aaron and they wanted his read. Tesseract's report to Korath was transmitted on a channel they believed was secure. It was not secure. Tesseract said, "Do not make them angry. They are not angry now. Keep it that way." Korath returned to the table. Over the following 3 weeks, something happened in that negotiation room that nobody had expected, including us. The Keth, stripped of their audience and stripped of the comfortable fiction that Earth was manageable, turned out to be, as Claire had written long ago, actually quite reasonable. Korath was not a bad being. He was a being who had grown up in a system where the Keth were central and everything else was peripheral, and he had never seriously questioned it because the system had always rewarded him for not questioning it. Faced with evidence that the system had a flaw, and faced with an opponent who was not trying to humiliate him, he adapted. Not quickly, not happily, but genuinely. The Cashin Roman 4 colonies were discussed. The other 2 installations were discussed. The question of the Keth boundary declaration was discussed. Aaron did not raise his voice once. He did not threaten anything. When Korath proposed something that was not acceptable, Aaron said so clearly and explained why and offered an alternative. When Korath proposed something that was workable, Aaron said so and they moved forward. On the 14th day, an agreement on Cashin Roman 4 was reached. The Keth boundary declaration was formally retracted. The 3 colonies would remain under Earth's administration with a joint monitoring arrangement that meant, in practice, very little additional oversight. The Keth would not acknowledge the platforms publicly, which was an ego accommodation that cost us nothing. The agreement was signed on a Friday. I was in the relay room when it came through. I printed a copy and walked down the hall to the room with no windows, which was still our main conference room after 40 years, and I put the copy in the center of the table where Yale's coffee cup usually sat. She was not there. It was not a Tuesday. I called her. She listened to the summary. She asked 3 precise questions about the wording of 2 specific clauses. She said the wording was acceptable. Then she was quiet for a moment. "And the charter amendment," she said. "First reading in 6 weeks," I said. "Tella is sponsoring it." "Good girl," Yale said softly, not condescending. "Proud. The way you are proud of someone you have never met but whose grandmother you remember." "We are not done," I said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "Cashin is one. There are still 17 conclave species that voted against us in 2247 and have never formally revisited that position. There are still 3 charter provisions that leave Category 2 species without emergency protections. There are still the Alluri, who need a permanent voice and do not have one. That will take years." "Probably," she said, "but we are good at years." I looked at the signed agreement on the table. Then I looked at the window, where London was gray and ordinary and fine. "Yale," I said, "do you think they will take us seriously now?" She thought about it for a moment, which she rarely did. She usually answered immediately. The pause meant she was being honest rather than tactical. "Some of them," she said. "The rest will need more time. People usually need more time." I sat down. I was 67 and tired and satisfied in a way that had no clean name. "Do you remember the Hall of Recognition?" I asked. "The day you stood at the podium." "I remember everything about that day." "Were you scared?" Another pause, longer. "I was," she said. "Not of them. I was scared we had misread it, that we had invested all of that in the wrong assumption, and we would arrive there and they would surprise us by actually listening, and then we would have nothing to point to. No case to make. Just a room full of polite strangers and 40 years of preparation for a conflict that never came. I thought about that. Would that have been so bad? No, she said immediately. It would have been wonderful. It would have been the best outcome we could have hoped for. Another pause. But it would have meant starting over, because the problem was never the Keth specifically. The problem was a system that allowed any species to be laughed out of that chamber, and you cannot fix that system with politeness. I understood. I had understood for a long time, but I liked hearing her say it. Get some rest, she said. Tella's first reading is in 6 weeks and I want to be there. She would be 82 by then. She would use a cane. She would sit in a gallery seat in the Hall of Recognition, which in the Vreth language actually translated closer to the hall where things are heard, a distinction that Tella had quietly moved to make the official translation in the Charter's next printing. Yale would sit in that gallery with her cane and watch a young Vreth delegate read an amendment into the record that said, in language that had taken 3 months to agree on and that Aaron had personally fought for in every session. No species, regardless of classification tier, shall address this body without the full weight of its words being recorded, reviewed, and formally considered within 90 days of delivery. It was not a dramatic sentence. It was a procedural sentence. It was the kind of sentence that lives in appendices and reference documents and that most beings walk past without reading. It would change everything. Not because of what it said, but because of what it meant, that the next species to stand at that podium and present their history with all its scars and all its wrong turns and all its evidence of having nearly failed would not be laughed at. Their words would be recorded. They would be reviewed. They would be heard. Yale would watch the vote on that amendment from the gallery. She would not be at the podium. She had made sure of it. She had asked Tella to sponsor it. She had asked Aaron to negotiate it. She had asked me to draft the filing language. She knew what happened when a human stood at that podium. She knew what the room looked like from the center versus the edge. She wanted the amendment passed without the Keth being able to frame it as a human demand. She wanted them to vote for it because Tella asked them to, and Tella was Vreth, and the Vreth had never bothered anyone. The vote passed 41-2, with no abstentions. The 2 who voted against it were a small isolationist civilization called the Drath, who voted against everything on principle, and who we had already begun building a relationship with through their agricultural ministry, which had a seed bank problem we were uniquely positioned to help with. Nobody is a lost cause, Claire had written in her 3rd research report 30 years earlier. Some are simply not ready yet. Patience is not weakness. Patience is information management. You hold the conversation until the moment the other party is capable of hearing it. I thought about that often in the years that followed, because there were many more conversations. There always are. Cashin was one. The Charter Amendment was one. Tella's rising influence in the conclave, which produced 7 more procedural reforms over the next 12 years, was another. The Alluri gaining associate membership with full emergency protections was another. The 14 species that quietly reached out to Earth's diplomatic office after the Cashin incident, not to negotiate, just to talk, were 14 more. None of it looked like victory exactly. It looked like work. It looked like sitting in a room without windows with a cup of bad coffee, making a list, and then going through the list. Yale Duren died at 88. She had spent the last 5 years of her life as an informal advisor to the Conclave's new Emerging Species Committee, a body that had not existed before Cashin, and that now had 12 full-time staff, and a mandate to ensure that no species arriving at the hall for the first time would be met with silence or amusement, or the smooth, confident certainty of beings who had decided what you were before you opened your mouth. Her official memorial was held in London. It was attended by diplomatic representatives from 19 species, which was the most of any human state funeral in history. Tella sent a personal message that was read aloud. Korath, who had retired from the Keth delegation and was now an academic, sent a handwritten note through the physical courier system, which he had learned was the form of message humans considered most sincere. It said she was patient with us when we had not earned it. I do not have a word in my language for what that is. Perhaps you do. We do, we have several. The closest one is probably grace, which means strength that does not need to display itself to be real. I sat at the memorial in the third row. I was 79. Oliver sat beside me. Aaron sat on my other side, 50 now, with more scars from more shuttle incidents that he was irrationally proud of. Claire's daughter was in the row behind us. Grant's granddaughter, who was finishing her doctoral thesis on the 7th-generation drive systems, sat in the back. I looked at the empty chair at the front of the room, the one they had placed beside the podium where her photograph sat, and I thought about 40 years in a room without windows, about 11-second deployments and second manifests and behavioral libraries, and the look on Tesseract's face in the 7th register, and a young Vreth delegate reading a dead woman's minority report into the galactic record. I thought about the laugh that had filled the Hall of Recognition in 2247, and how it had felt, and what it had produced, and what the woman at the center of it had decided to do with it. I thought about what it means to be underestimated. Not the sting of it, not the unfairness of it, but the practical fact of it. That when someone looks at you and decides you are not a threat, they stop watching. And the moment they stop watching is the moment you begin to build. Not a weapon, not a force, something quieter and more durable than either. A record. A list. A room full of people who know, in their bones, that problems that nearly end you are still problems that you survived. That the scars are not evidence of fragility. They are evidence of the opposite. They are the ledger of everything that came at you full force and found out. After the memorial, I walked out into the London afternoon. The sky was still gray and still ordinary and still fine. Oliver walked beside me. We did not say much. After a while he said, "What do we do now?" I thought about it. I thought about the 14 minor species who had reached out and needed help navigating the conclave. I thought about the Charter's 3 remaining provisions that still left gaps in emergency protections. I thought about the Drath and their isolationism and their vote against the amendment and the long, patient conversation we hadn't started yet. I thought about a young woman, somewhere, maybe already born, who would one day stand at the center of a hall on some station we had not built yet, and say words that the room would not yet be ready to hear, and would do so without flinching because the systems we had built would ensure that the words were recorded, reviewed, and heard. I thought about what it means to plan not for the world you are standing in, but for the world you are trying to build, which is slower and harder, and requires a kind of faith that is less about certainty and more about deciding that the work is worth doing regardless. I said, "The same thing we always do." Oliver glanced at me. "We go back," I said, "and we keep working." He nodded. We turned the corner. The London street was gray and narrow and full of people going about their days, loud and opinionated and relentless and ordinary, completely ordinary, the most ordinary and stubborn and irreplaceable things in any galaxy, and I felt fine. I felt more than fine. I felt like someone who had confirmed something they had long suspected. We walked.